Feels like it's been forever and it's only been like 2 weeks since I last recorded. Hello everybody, my name is Dolce Jeans and today I'm going to be attempting to talk about the elimination of gender norms or gender roles in fashion. I'm already going to put the disclaimer, I'm not going to be able to talk about every single super important designer that has contributed to this, or else we'd be here for days and days and days. So I'm talking about the ones that I think will provide the most easily digestible work and contributions so that I could put it, in video form to get it across to you guys. So again, it's not everybody. Don't like, if I left out your fave or who you think is the most important, please just relax. Okay, let's get into it. So in this topic of eliminating gender norms, I feel like there's three ways you can go about it. Is one, you can go about just eliminating gender completely and not making clothes that are meant for like any sex, like not even unisex. I'm talking about clothes that look like they don't belong on people. I also feel like you can go about it in an androgynous way, which is more like, that's by like either having men's gender norms diminished by adding female elements to their dress or appearance, or having female gender norms diminished by adding men's elements to their dress. And usually you can't diminish one without diminishing the other, but I just wanted to like separate it in terms of like what medium is mainly being attacked, whether it's like menswear or women's wear. That's how we're splitting it. So I'm gonna start with the non-binary version. Now I read an essay on the Rosenrod about defining androgyny and gender bending, and it was good, but there was something I disagreed upon where the author, I think her name is Gracia Ventus, she spoke about how what fashion considers androgyny isn't actually androgyny because all it does is basically highlights the fact that there are gender norms. And androgyny, of course, is when you mix male and female appearance or elements together to create a fusion of the gender. And she says that's not really androgyny because all it does is basically live off of the fact that we know that these things aren't supposed to be like this. So it only highlights gender norms instead of eliminating them. I personally disagree because I think that narrative is kind of weak, because if you look at the word androgyny itself, it basically means men and women, and when you mix it together you get androgyny in like the original Greek or Latin word creation of it. And she was saying like when you put a man in a skirt, you're not actually attacking gender norms because a skirt isn't inherently feminine, but showing off curves is an inherently feminine thing. So they're actually relying more on the idea of showing off curves being feminine than the actual skirt itself. I don't really think it's that simple. I think Judith Butler made a really good point in one of her books. I'm gonna put the name on the screen because I don't remember at the moment, but she was basically saying that gender and gender norms are established through the repetition of acts that are associated with gender in society. So like when you keep on doing certain things, that is established as a component of the gender or a characteristic of it. So I do think that there are things like pieces of clothing that could be inherently male or female. And I also think because of the repetition of a certain gender wearing it, it does take on that role of belonging to a certain gender because of who has assimilated it the most throughout history. But I do agree a lot with what she said about that being a form of androgyny, genderless fashion, fashion that has no feminine or masculine form. I do agree with that, and I'm going to expound on that. She also explains how Western culture is the part of the world that really, really emphasizes menswear and women's wear and the difference, whereas Eastern culture is often a huge influence in androgynous wear because Eastern cultures, the clothing that they make aren't really designed to show off any curves or shape. They just never considered trying to accentuate the body in the first place. I'm trying not to get too much into the theory, so let's get into our first example of the elimination of gender norms in non-binary fashion with Rick Owens, actually. Let's start with the Porterville Brother and Sister collection. To quote Rick himself, the collection proportions are grotesque and inhuman, in a howling reaction to some of the most disappointing human behavior we'll ever witness in our lifetime. Emphasis on the inhuman part for the sake of my argument, right? That's mainly why we're putting it into this video, because of the inhuman part. It's not supposed to look like it belongs to a man or a woman. It's alien, it's inhuman. Other leads as to why this collection looked the way how it looked is because he was just doing a commentary on the unattainable beauty standards of the world and like the airport luxury, the airport beauty. I think that's what he called it, the airport beauty that we uphold in terms of being perfect all the time, just having this beautiful look all the time, just being flawless all the time. He was never interested in that type of glamour. Rick was always interested in more of like primitive, real human beings. So this is no, like, this isn't that different for Rick to have that type of standpoint in terms of why he's creating his clothes to look the way how they look. I think looking at the show side by side as a brother and sister collection will also be very effective because some of the pieces are literally repeated, and that is like a very strong point in my opinion of breaking down the boundaries of menswear, women's wear that a lot of designers have been trying to break down all their careers. So starting with the inflatable rubber boots, these things don't look like they belong to anybody in my opinion. These things look like if you bit them, it would just be like a whole bunch of like sludge or petroleum coming out of them. Like they look like, I don't even know. I think they're fantastic. The only difference between shows is that the versions put on women were sleeker as they were a bit deflated. And sleekness is in general usually associated with women's wear due to women's bodies being sleeker. But I don't think there's a separate men's and women's version of the shoe. So my alien footwear point still stands, hopefully. Both of the shows feature these poncho-like shawls that said Porterville on them that deny typical proportions, like where it sat on the waist, how slim it was on the body, things like that. No suggestive colors, pretty neutral colors for both of the pieces. Knitted headpieces were worn by the models to destroy and remove any type of gender association with certain hairstyles. Huge big wrapped pieces of furs or knits or other materials obscured and distorted the midsection of models, giving them an impossible shape. There were some really chunky numbers of wrapped puffers. Wrapped isn't really the right thing to say, but they were kind of like these rotund balls of puffer material that had like stitching that conveyed movement inwards toward the zipper, implying motion to and from the origin point. I'd argue that the androgyny even goes down to the simple cape looks that we see in the collection. The closing numbers weren't even closed. There were these sequined, like rope-like ornaments that, yes, exposed skin, which is a more feminine thing in society, but the men wore them too, so of course, there were still conventionally male and female pieces in the collection, but Rick has to make money, so yeah. This collection was actually very fresh in my mind when I first started to do this video because I immediately thought like this was like very, very, very clear cut, just not male, not female, not anything. It was still very fresh in my mind from where it happened. And if you covered your face and went out in some of these looks in public, I genuinely believe that nobody would really know if it was a man or a woman underneath it. So I think the goal was achieved. Good job, Rick. Next, we're going to talk about Issey Miyake. Now, Issey Miyake did do menswear and womenswear frequently, but I mainly want to talk about a lot of his earlier work that really, really took strange shapes, especially the type of clothes that were, photographed by Irving Penn. Now, Issey's main goals in terms of why he creates clothes and what he seeks to emulate in his clothes include things like displaying serious fun in life, being able to give back to the earth when making biodegradable clothes or clothes that can last very long and then be recycled at the end of their life cycle. His clothing speaks on the ephemerality of life, and in order to achieve this unique living experience, he often produces clothes with very strange silhouettes. In the Rosenrock article, Gracia did say how Issey Miyake took initial cues from like the kimono to create some of the shapes that he created, and the kimono was an Eastern silhouette, and we will be talking about the kimono later on with some other designers. But that is also a big part to play in it. The fact that I think Issey Miyake has a viewpoint that's very from where he's from, like a Japanese viewpoint, Eastern viewpoint in terms of not having these Western ideals of creating clothes that are so form fitting and so made to curve around the body for women, and he was mainly a women's wear designer. I think a lot of his clothes are very voluptuous and they focus on the space created between the body and the clothing. I think that is extremely important for any Issey Miyake garment, is how it interacts with the body and how it shapes or doesn't shape the body. This is not the strongest example because yes, Issey has many different lines for men and women specifically, and he also does have clothes that mainly adorn women, like very specifically, but I think Issey does fit the build here for a lot of pieces that he has made in the past, where it's very Eastern inspired and it doesn't attempt to shape the body specifically in any way. Okay, before I get into more designers that have done a lot for androgyny, I do want to speak about fashion in general and androgyny in society and how it's evolved. I have read a lot of essays that have helped aid my understanding of this entire phenomenon because obviously I wasn't that knowledgeable of this going into it. So I will be referencing a lot of those essays. Now, if you look at fashion throughout the years, fashion was always indicative of a few things. It was always indicative of your obligation in society in terms of what you were supposed to be doing and in terms of what you were capable of doing. And it kind of dictated it through physical and literal means. So when I say obligation, if you look at what royals wore, royals, like royal men would wear things that are now considered feminine, like heels and stockings and really, really big voluptuous tops and pieces like that, because you can't really do labor in clothes like that. It's not suited for labor at all. And this was indicative of the fact that royals were not laborers, they were not peasants, they were not doing hard work, they were royals. They were sitting in the royal rooms every day making decisions or just not doing anything because they were royals. If you look on the peasants had one size fit all type of clothing because they just worked in these type of clothes. So these clothes were more less flattering and more dull colors, looser, in less expensive fabric, less flashy fabric. That's what they were wearing. If you look at what women were wearing, women were never expected to work. So women were wearing things that were a lot more indicative of that, along with objectifying and just basically keeping them crystallized as a trophy and never to be even like moving properly, because women used to wear things like comically large hats, comically large dresses, corsets that were very restrictive to the body. I don't know why I said body like that. Certain type of shoes that weren't suitable for work. So women's clothes literally were indicative of the fact that they weren't physically capable of doing any type of hard labor. On top of that, women's clothes were always supposed to show off their body or show some type of beauty, or just paint them in this picture as this dainty flower, this fragile thing that needed to be protected, this delicate thing, this, this beautiful thing that should never be touched or never had to do any type of hard work. Also, this does tie into what Gracia was saying in the Rosenrot, where in Western society, especially, the biggest selling point for fashion is when you show off biological features of the body that are supposed to be sexy because they're dimorphic. When you emphasize sexual traits in men or women that prove very much so that they're men or women, like big muscles or the legs of a man, and that's before legs became like a woman thing. These were the selling points for men's clothes, and they still are today. If you look at how men are depicted in magazines and how women find men attractive, it's when they show off their biologically dimorphic features. Same with women. That's why we have so much like Lululemon, like BBL clothes that are made of spandex, so that they can stretch and show off the curves and hug the body in all the right places. Same thing with a designer like Tom Ford. His clothes were designed to sell due to that part of like the human mind, like the male gaze and the female gaze. His models were sexy, and they were always in these clothes that hugged them the right way and showed off the right pieces of their body, because that is what sells the most in Western culture. So back to what I was saying with the things that were rooted in misogyny for women, it was always supposed to keep them as this trophy that was never supposed to work. The heels, the stockings, the big dresses, making it almost impossible for them to even move without like lifting up their dress, or not being able to wear corsets for long because it made them short of breath. It was all very restrictive, and it was just to paint this picture of this beautiful thing that was never supposed to work. I keep on saying the same thing, I'm sorry. Now in World War I, a lot of women were actually forced to do some type of work, especially for the men that were going to war, whether it was like medical or other small things that they could pitch into. After World War I, everybody's wardrobe sort of toned down, and so did the woman's wardrobe. It was no longer that restrictive, and that was with the help of people like Paul Poiret and Chanel. Now, I know Paul Poiret is mainly accredited for the removal of the corset in the women's wardrobe, but Chanel really took it a step further, so we're talking about Chanel now. I read a lot about Coco Chanel in this essay called Undressing the Power of Fashion by Sveva Markangeli. I hope that's how you pronounce it, Markangeli? Markangeli explains that although Chanel never called herself a feminist, she spoke a lot about femininity and how her work was indisputably part of the liberation of women. Markangeli essentially picked 3 different Chanel garments to semiotically analyze and figure out how they affected femininity and gender norms during this time period. The first one was a little black dress that Chanel picked or made in 1926. Now the little black dress had features like a flat chest that was supposed to be more boyish and masculine. It was black, which at the time wasn't the most flattering color. It was mainly associated with mourning and low life peasantry, and also the black that was in the suits of men. So it was a masculine thing and also like a mourning thing and also peasantry. She put the women in a black dress, and the dress was very long, very loose, and it allowed a lot of freedom of movement and elegance. This little black dress is a very, very, very important piece in fashion. To this day, we can see the influence of it and the remnants of it. It's very, very important. It gave women the freedom from corsets. It gave them the freedom from having their bust always like accentuated in some way, even if they didn't even have that much. And it was chic and elegant, and it just wasn't so fussy. And it also shifted the color black from the horrible connotations that it had before into something more woman-like. This is probably the first example we'll see of masculine norms having the power taken away from them because of them being blended into women. And when I say women, I mean like women's wear. Chanel seeks to give women the same power that men had in society, and she did that by taking these pieces of masculine conventions and blending it with their wardrobe. The other piece of clothing I'm going to speak about from Chanel is the boyish look ensemble. It's not really one piece of clothing, it's more like 2 or 3. It didn't accentuate any part of the body. It was cut way above the ankle for mobility, and when paired with a black coat, it reiterated the color black as a color of sophistication, elegance, and strength. 30 years after the little black dress, because the little black dress debuted in 1926 and the boyish look ensemble debuted in 1956. So now we're going to speak about the infamous Chanel suit, which is still present today as well. The infamous Chanel tweed suit was first seen in the 1925 variation. With these suits, she was seeking to dress women and I quote, in suits that make them feel at ease, but that still emphasize femininity. The design evolved over the years through changes in material, silhouette, etc., but the goal remained the same for Chanel. Now, Chanel retired in 1939 after feeling like the new wave of fashion or the new era of fashion was something that she had nothing to give to, so she gracefully bowed out until Christian Dior came through and just started messing everything up, in her opinion. He was one of, if not the main reason why she came out of retirement straight up. There's a quote from Diana de Marley from 1990 that I found in a book called Fashionology by Yunia Kamamura. The image that Chanel was portraying was very different from that of Dior. To her, he was the epitome of the bad male designer who imposed all sorts of artificial shapes upon women without ever referring to the fundamental nature of women's bodies, and Dior assumed the right to instruct women in remodeling themselves to suit his fantasies. He loved flowers, so let all women bloom into roses. The picture may be charming, but it does not hold up very well in the real world, where the majority of women had to work for a living, and blooming dresses would soon suffer from the blight of travel, weather, children, and machines. So Chanel was like, all right, I'm going to come through and save the day. She returned to fashion in 1954 with an updated version of her Chanel tweed suit. Now, the updated version of the suit had features like gilt buttons and braiding to outline and reinforce the hem of the suits. Now, this return only really made a big splash in America. It wasn't very well received in Paris, especially as she had a lot of other drama in her life going on between her retirement and her relaunching of her brand. But Chanel worked tirelessly over the next decade to try and push the Chanel suit to perfection and perfecting the look. And that is why we still see the Chanel suit so copied and so just incorporated in general fashion today. It is very iconic, and Chanel always had women at heart, trying to give women the same type of strength that men had in a suit with her own version of the suit. Chanel was a real feminist at heart, even if she never called herself that. In Judith Thurman's profile for Rei Kawakubo in the New Yorker called The Misfit, she explains how Chanel is Rei Kawakubo's perfect foil. They both started from an egalitarian premise that a woman should derive from her clothes the ease and confidence that a man does. But Chanel formulated a few simple and lucrative principles from which she never wavered that changed the way how women wanted to dress, while Kawakubo, who reinvents the wheel, or tries to, every season, change the way how one thinks about what a dress is. Or what dress is, sorry. I can't even say like allegations aside, but drama aside, Chanel is very, she's very, very important to women everywhere if they don't even realize it. This outrage against Dior was also because after World War II, a lot of women were like incorporated into the workforce, and they didn't want to go back to the life of not working. So when Dior tried to just basically turn them into beautiful trophies again, they weren't really having it. And like I stated before, clothes are very indicative of what you are expected to do in society, along with the fact that women didn't really get a chance to form their identities as much because all of their clothes looked the same and there was nothing that they could really choose between. When men had a variety of options on how they wanted to present, women had the same things over and over again, and they needed something new. Now, let's take a slight jump to the 1970s and the liberation of women in the 1970s and the work movement. Do I call it the work movement? The boom of women in the workforce in the 1970s and onwards. Okay, post World War II, women started to adapt men's codes for many reasons. One mainly being because men were the ones who gained respect in society, so adopting men's codes was a way in order for them to try and gain respect. So things like bobs, yes, bobs were a man thing before. Bobs, drinking in public, smoking in public, things like that, going to bars, things like that. On top of this, women were starting to enter the workforce in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s, and they were liberating themselves. And the restriction of women in general was just toned down, so were the clothes. So even in women's wardrobe, things like jeans were starting to be included. Now, there's a quote in Fashionopolis by Dana Thomas about jeans, especially with what Calvin Klein did with jeans. So I'm gonna find it for y'all. With the women liberation movement and the popularity of more casual dress, New York's fashion designers dreamed up a new fashion category, designer jeans. With slim cut legs and seats that cup the rear, designer jeans embody the epoch's hedonism and Madison Avenue swagger. Jeans are sex, Calvin Klein said. The tighter they are, the better they sell. Back to the idea of biologically dimorphic body parts being the main selling point for genders in Western culture. To hammer this point home, in 1980, Klein cast 15-year-old actress Brooke Shields for his jeans commercial. You want to know what comes between me and my Calvins? Nothing. The ad was so provocative that the New York affiliates of ABC and CBS promptly banned it, but it already worked its spell. Klein sold 400,000 pairs the first week following the ad's debut, then 2 million a month after that. Jean sales rocketed to record highs. More than 500 million jeans were purchased in 1981 alone. Now I know that was like 1980 or whatever, but it started in the 70s, so that's why I mentioned it. And this is to show that sex will just always sell, no matter how progressive we're getting. That will always be the main thing that sells, especially in Western culture. Now, with women going into the work field, they needed clothes that would not sell them as objects, that would have them be respected as men and have the same power as men. Enter Jil Sander. Jil Sander created her brand in 1968, and the first collection under that name came in 1973. She was one of these female designers who never once actually called herself a feminist, but had very early designs in that realm. She was from the very beginning concerned with making comfortable, functional, and subtly flattering clothing out of fantastic materials. She basically walked so people like Phoebe Philo and the Olsen twins and Victoria Beckham could run, really. She really didn't like the fashion of her times, and she wanted to give women the option to be free, strong, beautiful, and elegant without the loudness and extravagance of a Barbie doll. Her products were timeless, very high quality, and intricately detailed to give the wearer a unique and personal experience. Now, in terms of the working world changing and women's position in society changing, Jill Sander herself said that, yes, I'm not a feminist, but I looked at the changing times and I thought to myself that women are going into these new spaces that are male dominated, and males are the ones with all the respect. So I want to give women the same opportunity. They need to have the same tools, the same equipment to go into this world and gain the same respect and be presented with the same power as men. So she started to create clothes that were reminiscent of the male wardrobe, like suits, clothes that didn't show off the body all the time or hugged all the body all the time and just objectified women. She started to make clothes that forced men to give them respect, because you couldn't objectify women in those type of clothing, and it was still very feminine. It just had men's tropes. But these designs were so personal. There were personal details in the clothing, like the lining of the clothing, how it just felt on the body because of the materials, that they really meant something to women. So it was more of a personal experience, and the relationship between the body and the clothes was emphasized. And for a lot of women wearing clothes, this was the first time they ever had something like this, because all the clothes previously were super misogynistic and meant to just show these women off as trophies and eye candy. This was in the 1970s. Jill Sander was very famous in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s until she left her brand, I think, in around 2000. And Raf took over for a while, and then she went back, and then she left again, and now she's doing stuff with she was doing stuff with Uniqlo, and her legacy lives on as one of the early trailblazers of the whole feminism in fashion. Now, I wanted to include her in terms of eliminating gender norms, because she was one of the first women after like Chanel who really felt like, okay, the times are changing, women need support, I'm going to give them that support. And she did this by incorporating male elements in her clothing, along with just removing all of the frivolous, vapid, misogynistic, objectifying tropes and traits of feminine clothes in the time. But that's Jill Sander. Moving on from Jill Sander, in the 70s and later on, we have Rei Kawakubo. Now, Rei Kawakubo is pretty much most famously known for always challenging conformity in the fashion system and the world in general, asking questions like, why is this like this? Why is this like that? Why can't this be this? Why can't this be that? I know that sounds like a really dumbed down version, but I am trying to make it brief and concise. She also has constantly challenged things like gender norms and beauty standards that were set by the pompous high board of fashion or whoever decides. She doesn't really like things like that. Like, who decides things like that? Who decides what's beautiful? Who decides what's not beautiful? She has been extremely financially successful, as well as very critically acclaimed and artistically revered as one of the most forward-thinking designers of all time, one of the most important designers of all time, for her work with Comme des Garçons and her many diffusion lines that make her all the money. She, Yohji Yamamoto, and Issey Miyake, who are often considered as the big three of Japan or whatever, that came to France and did their thing, they brought Japanese tradition and customs and dress into France and the rest of the Western world and popularized it there. I was reading a piece by Jordan Nguyen for the Fashion Research Collection of Toronto Metropolitan University about a black women's frock coat done by Rei Kawakubo in the early 1990s. This was because I wanted to understand more about Rei and her work, so I started to look into more scholarly examples of decoding her work, because I didn't have that knowledge myself. This is just one of the pieces that I read for her though. While reading this essay, I did end up coming across another connection of Eastern dress being more androgynous than Western dress inherently. To quote, while Western styles embraced form-fitting silhouettes that accentuated the contours of the body, Japanese aesthetics rejected this. Kawakubo traced one of her fundamental influences to kimonos, which are geared towards a contourless body. We see the kimono returning as an influence on not attempting to contour the body at all or accentuate the body at all. A very important piece of clothing. The oversized silhouette of the coat basically gives the body the option of modesty, concealing it while still having a good look. You know, it doesn't have to necessarily look all cinched in or close to the body. It's modest. And also going back to the understanding that androgyny is a fusion and in some cases confusion of gender when you put male and female traits together. Rei Kawakubo has the understanding that Rei said something along this same line of thought. Fashion design is not about revealing or accentuating the shape of a woman's body. Its purpose is to allow a person to be who they are. Now, in gender debates about how you come across the new gender, which is what androgyny basically ultimately adds up to, it's like I said just a while ago, the fusion and confusion of male and female gender by adding components of one and the other to create a new identity. Androgyny is all about freedom because it creates the new gender. When you put together two genders, you get something new. We're going to be speaking more about that specifically when we get to Alessandro Michele later on in the video, so please stay tuned. A paper titled Reconstructing a National Silhouette, Avant-Garde Fashion and Perceptions of the Japanese Body by Jean Coerolo. Oh my god, I just butchered his name so bad. He shared a quote from Rei Kawakubo when asked about whether or not fashion is a purely aesthetic activity. She said, "What you can wear largely governs your feelings and your emotions, and how you look influences the way people regard you. So fashion plays an important role both on the practical level and the aesthetic level." Now, this is an extremely important part of Rei Kawakubo's philosophy along with androgyny and how she makes clothes and who she has in mind. Basically, what she's getting at is that there are two types of, well, not what she's getting at, but what John Carollo also was getting at is that there are two types of designers in society. The designer that designs for the people who are looking at you and their satisfaction, and the designer that designs for the wearer's satisfaction. Now, most designers will design for the people's satisfaction, giving you a safe option, a safe, publicly accepted option of wearing clothes that look stylish to everybody. So they're not as daring, they're not as risky to wear, because it's very risky to wear something that doesn't fit into convention. It's risky to wear things that go against the grain. Most designers don't give you that risk. Most designers will masquerade as, oh, this is daring because this is on the cutting edge. It has a weird cut here. The color is like this, so this is different. You're ahead of the curve. You're taking risks. No, most of the clothes that are in high fashion are not very risky at all, and nobody will bat an eye if they've seen you in it. I'm not saying that all crazy clothes are necessarily forward thinking, and I'm not saying that all boring clothes are necessarily not. But when designers try and frame it as if you're being different because of wearing their brand and their brand is all about risk, no. Rei Kawakubo is somebody who gives you the power to wear what you want to wear because she's making clothes that have meaning to you because you're the one who's understanding it. She's in the conversation with you and not anybody that's looking at you. I hope this isn't just word soup. We can see elements of Rei Kawakubo really speaking to people specifically because most comme des garçons wearers end up having like closets full of it and that becomes their wardrobe. There was even a cult of comme des garçons wearers in Japan who were named like the Crows because of how much they wore straight comme des garçons and nothing else. We all know a comme des garçons head who wears nothing but comb. Like, we all know somebody like that. Now, the dichotomy of power that a wearer of comme des garçons has is further explained by John through a review of Comme des Garçons Spring Summer 1997, Body Meets Dress, Dress Meets Body, and Autumn Winter 2005 Broken Bride. Now, for Body Meets Dress, Dress Meets Body, the power is put into the wearer's hand. For the opening 4 or 5 looks of the collection, Comme des Garçons sends out numbers of gingham. I think that's how you pronounce it, gingham or gingham. And basically, this fabric is the perfect fabric that she could have chose to subvert a fabric for this collection because gingham has ties to like housewife culture and childishness and youth and school uniform in the world itself, like the real world. That's what gingham over time had the connotations of because of the repeated stylized acts of what it was associated with. Certain people wearing it, how they wore it, why they wore it. Gingham ended up taking on certain connotations. Focusing on the implications of a docile woman wearing it, housewife implications, she wanted to subvert that by saying, hey, we're going to take this fabric and we're going to put lumps and bumps inside of it so that, no, we're not just this, like, women aren't just these docile creatures who are just submissive to men who just get rolled over and ordered what to do. No, like, we're taking this ideal symbol of feminine beauty that was created by the West and we're turning it on its head. Now, the collection wasn't all gingham, it was only the first few looks, but it's definitely a strong opening number to set the tone for the collection if you did catch that off rip. Most people probably wouldn't catch something like that off rip. I know I didn't. I'm not educated on stuff like gingham, I don't know. But the entire collection had lumps of, I think it was down, that was just extra fabric being pushed in certain places like the belly, the back, the shoulders, to show that your beauty standards that you bourgeois people in France have are not really certify. Like, who decides what's beautiful and what's not? Who's to say that this is not beautiful? If you consider it not beautiful, is that law? If this woman goes outside in this dress and she feels beautiful because she's empowered, because she knows who she is, and this is how she wants to represent herself, isn't that beautiful? But if it doesn't look conventional to your eyes, you're gonna call it not beautiful, then who's right? And the general public would, of course, look at these type of things and shake their head like, why are they wearing that? What is that? Is that a costume? Who would wear that? Where would you wear that to? And the wearers of these dresses actually had testimonies of getting strange looks and strange remarks when they have worn these clothes outside. But just like John, I believe that the wearer was the one who wielded the power, because this dress spoke to them first before anybody else could see it. And before anybody else can understand it, they understand it first. It's not easily understandable to anybody outside, but you have to understand this dress and want to wear it in order to wear it. So you already have all the power, and it's giving you all the power the minute you connect with it and decide to put it on. And that's the true confidence that people who wear Comme des Garçons often have. And that's the type of person that Rei Kawakubo designs for. Now, for Broken Bride Autumn Winter 2005, Rei Kawakubo takes the undeniable, untouched idea and physical, of course, piece of clothing, the wedding dress, and creates narrative around marriage and how it affects women in society and the unbearable, crazy, fluctuating, unrealistic load that women have to carry throughout their entire lives. The wedding dress is this very Western ideal of this all white thing with all these beautiful frills and laces and different materials. And wedding dresses, of course, signify moments in women's life where their independence is shattered and they take on a whole new life. And there's the death of the previous life and the creation of the new, which is basically always dependence on a man expected to have kids, raise a family, be the docile housewife that basically just spends her entire time creating a household, and it signifies the weight that they have to carry in terms of that type of lifestyle that they are now bound to after marriage, and how marriage in Western society has that type of connotation. The beauty of a wedding dress is never challenged. It's something that everybody thinks is such a beautiful piece of clothing. Like, oh, a wedding dress is just associated with this wonderful moment. So, oh, it's never been questioned before, and I guess that's an easy target for Rei to just make the subject of a collection. So elements of the wedding dress in this collection were tweaked to show signs of imperfection, like uneven neck marks, asymmetrical sleeves, showing midriff, which is a classic form of female rebellion, turning the bottom half of the wedding dress into trousers. And later on in the collection, the dresses actually turn black near the end to signal the new chapter of the woman's life and the new woman that she has to become because of the marriage. It's the death of what was previously there. Other elements of perfect femininity were included in the collection, like smooth doll-like makeup, crystals around the eyes, beautiful headpieces here and there. These type of elements were to also speak on the rigid beauty of a wedding dress and how this is just such a perfect thing. The wedding dress itself was critiqued here as all of these uneven like necklines and asymmetrical sleeves and these variations that were made to the wedding dress shows us how hard it is to change the perspectives of somebody watching Western ideals and Western beauty standards, because no matter how many things Rei Kawakubo can do to this wedding dress, change the color, change the shape, change the whole bottom of the dress to trousers, you're still going to identify as a wedding dress. And that just shows how strongly cemented in Western ideals something like a wedding dress is, and how hard it is to change Western beauty standards because of preconceived notions that were built up over time. I think the wedding dress is the perfect like antithesis of body meets dress, dress meets body, because instead of the lumps and the bumps that were put into those pieces of clothing that were obviously just denying all conventions of regular beauty, the wedding dress is like the epitome of Western beauty and what people consider beautiful. So no matter how much she tried to destroy that dress, it could never be destroyed in the minds of people who already know what it is and know what it represents. So it's a dress that far exceeds itself. Clothes that exceed their own beauty is something that Jean Baudrillard always spoke about fashion, and how fashion is supersedes its original purpose, and it basically dictates more of a signified meaning in society. This wedding dress would be a great example of that. Now, apart from those two collections, Rei Kawakubo has obviously taken many strides in society to just push against gender norms, push against what's supposed to be beautiful and what's not. push against why women are forced to wear these things, why these things have these connotations. She's done it through countless collections, Yoji Yamamoto as well, but I don't really feel like talking about Yoji in this video. Now, that Broken Bride collection was actually well understood by the audience, and that actually made Rei sad because she doesn't like when she's very well understood by the audience and they can understand exactly where she was coming from. Pretty sure she herself said that once too many people understand a collection, she considers a collection a failure, which is I think is funny, but I think it's a great example of the things that she considers valuable in fashion and what she's always trying to do with every collection. But yeah, that's Rei Kawakubo. Moving on to Jean-Paul Gaultier, right? Jean-Paul Gaultier has been a queer icon since the 70s. An openly queer French man born in 1952, instrumental in representing queer culture in fashion, film, and music in the late 20th century. Gaultier was one of the very first designers in mainstream fashion to represent queer style in film, most notably for the film The Fifth Element. Many characters in the film are seen in clothing that may not be conventional for their character, like Corbin Dallas, played by Bruce Willis, and in a classic orange tank top that exposed parts of the back. An exposed back was traditionally a feminine thing always, by the way. When speaking about why he had so many audacious looks for other characters in the movie compared to the main character only having that orange tank top, Jean-Paul Gaultier said that the mainstream needed to be eased into these type of ideas, so he didn't want to make the main character so shocking, he just wanted to make them basically an easy entryway character into the questions of why these things shouldn't be represented, or an entryway into somebody's exploration of queer culture if they're just getting into that. Very smart and calculated. Very, very good. A more audacious character in Fifth Element would be Ruby Rod by Chris Tucker, who has never explicitly stated his sexuality. He has done a wild, outrageous things in Fifth Element too. If you've seen that movie, like the flight attendant thing, crazy. His work with Madonna, another queer icon, cannot be understated. He designed her entire tour wardrobe for her Blonde Ambition tour in 1990, and many androgynous looks that were at the time not unheard of but still not mainstream were created, like wearing a pinstripe suit made for the body of a man over plastic cone breasts. We all know about those iconic torpedo breasts by now. It was also iconic that Jean-Paul Gaultier dressed her male backup dancers in these same get-ups. In an article titled Fantasyland by Susan Orlean, Jean-Paul Gaultier spoke about showing men in skirts in his 1984 runway show, saying, "It was not a gay statement, quite the contrary. Men were changing, they were not so macho, so I thought, why not?" And that's a motto of Jean-Paul Gaultier. Anybody that knows him will say he always just says, why not? Why can't we? Why can't we do this? And Jean-Paul Gaultier is a man who is very colorful. He loves like spectacular things, very exuberant, very eccentric. He is very calculated as well, as I said before. Like in one of his runway shows, he started to show women in leather. And back then, he grew up in the he was born in 1950. So he grew up in a time where leather and biker wear were like, it was an increasingly popular culture. And motorcycle gangs and biker gangs and stuff like that were very open, known to be very open, very accepting. So gay men and lesbians in gay clubs and places like that started to adopt leather as a subversion of the strong masculinity that were showed by these biker men because they were so accepting. So it was supposed to be like a queer thing where it's like, oh yeah, I'm very manly, I'm very strong, I'm very masculine. So lesbians would wear that and associate that with their wardrobe, and men would be wearing that in the gay clubs as well as a subversion. Jean-Paul Gaultier took this subversion further and put the leather on women in runway shows to show, hey, women can be strong too, women can be sexy too without doing all this crazy stuff. I know Jean-Paul Gaultier is known a lot for showing skin and bondage, but this is just another clever way in which he uses his own experience of knowing the meaning behind leather at the time and putting it on women to show that women can have the same strength as these men in these biker gangs. Another version of adding male tropes into female tropes in order to show female strength and start androgyny conversations. I really hope that doesn't seem like a reach because it's not. Moving on to Romeo Gigli. Romeo Gigli was a popular Italian designer who founded his brand in 1983 and left his own brand in 2004. Romeo Gigli's clothes were heavily characterized by androgyny and mixing the cultures that he gained along his travels. Now, when he was 18, or by the time he was fully 18, both of his parents had passed away and he decided to just travel the world for years after that. While he was doing this, he kept himself occupied and sharp with art and literature. He has acknowledged in the past that he explicitly designed clothes for the androgynous couple that share the same wardrobe, and many women prefer to wear trousers and men's shirts. In an interview with Philip Motweri for Dapper Dan magazine, he explains that he is fascinated when he sees a woman wearing her man's clothes, and that's why he often dressed them in such a way. I mainly brought up Gigli because although a lot of his work does pull from time periods like the pre-Raphaelites and the Byzantine period in order to evoke romanticism, there's a connection to be made also with the androgyny in his work and his influences from the Far and Middle East. This is again talking about how The eastern part of the world focuses less on accentuating the body. It's just always making the connections to make my point seem a bit better, you know what I mean? And of course, it's also interesting that he traveled all the world and his embroidery was mainly done in India. And he said that it was very cheap to do it in India. Well, not very cheap, it was cheaper than Europe, even though it was still expensive. And we can see him blazing trails for designers like Dries Van Noten, who ended up doing something very similar in the future, where he went to India and learned a lot about their embroidery techniques and decided to do a lot of his outsourcing over there. But he was still very involved in the process, just like Romeo Gigli. Speaking of Romeo Gigli, somebody who apprenticed for him who is very big on androgyny and empowering women in fashion, the GOAT, Alexander McQueen. Let's get into it, man. Now, the same essay that spoke about Chanel and her 3 pieces of clothing, they also spoke about McQueen and 3 pieces of his clothing. So some of my judgment was aided by that article, just let you know. My picks were Joanne for Autumn Winter 1998, It's a Jungle Out There, Fall Winter 97, and The Hunger, Spring Summer 1996. The Hunger was inspired by a movie called Cat People in 1980 about the sexual urges of a young woman turning her into a voracious black leopard, and The Hunger in 1983, a sexy vampire movie. The show included bumpsters, sharp tailoring, dresses and suits, sometimes leaving the breasts uncovered. The models had mad hairdos, sharp eyebrows, and intimidating demeanor. McQueen himself ordered these models to be like very vulgar, very mean towards the crowd, stomping and marching down the runway, flipping off the crowd, shouting obscenities at the crowd, just making up their face, being real like rude and fierce to the crowd, right? Now, of course, you have to take into consideration the time period in which these things were happening, where people weren't really used to seeing women like that on the runway depicted like that. This is in the middle of the Tom Ford era where it's just glitz and glamour and sex, bro. Like McQueen was doing it in a much more like in terms of sex, he was showing it in a much more aggressive way where it wasn't more so of the woman trying to be flaunty and seductive and like kind of like a really mainstream idealized way, but more in a sense where she's the one who's super confident about it to the point where it's like McQueen has that one quote where it's like, I like my woman to be really strong and fierce and independent. You have to have real balls to come up to her to speak to her. You know, I don't like my woman to look weak. And that's the type of woman that he was portraying. The Hunger was one of the earliest versions of this woman that didn't have like a different type of connotation to it, where it was speaking on a grander theme, and it was really just about really powerful, strong looking, scary, fierce looking women. I think also because he was putting these women in typically men's clothes like blazers and trousers and suits like that. I think that's one way McQueen often gave women power, mainly in his earlier career, like before the 2000s, where he would just put women in these super sharp tailored suits and send them out looking very fierce and very wild, and it was just showing his anger in his collections. Now, It's a Jungle Out There, Fall Winter 1997 was inspired by McQueen watching gazelles getting hunted down on a documentary, and he likened himself to the gazelles, and the hunters that were hunting the gazelles were like the industry. And he was like, oh, he literally pointed to the TV and was like, that's me. I'm running from the industry, and if I slip up, they'll get me and they'll eat me alive. McQueen wanted a wild animalistic look for his women during the show, and he requested these type of contributions from his makeup artist, his hairstylist, etc. The models marched down clad in leather and animal fur resembling animals of the wild like lions and wolves, with the same type of fierce, confident demeanor. This show was also a rousing success. Now, McQueen takes a route that is not very often taken in fashion at all in terms of portraying women as fierce, and he actually did it in an animalistic way, making these women appear like, I just said all of that, lions and wolves, but this is very different, and it just shows McQueen's execution and his inspiration point. Once he feels very strongly about something, he'll just hammer it home in whatever way he feels like is possible. Whether he wants to present these women as madhouse patients like Voss or in Plato's Atlantis or however he wants to do it. It is just showing them as straight up just powerful creatures, like powerful, primitive, like primal creatures, right? I think it was cool. I don't know. The last collection was Joanne Fall Winter 1998, and it was inspired by the life of Joanne of Arc. The show began with displays of chainmail, as it was a major part of Joanne's image as well as soldiers back during that era. Models were often pale and pretty much all had red contacts in their eyes. Some of the models had high hairlines with plaits of blonde that would start in the middle and unravel or spiral down to the front or the sides of the models' faces. And this look was similar to McQueen's look for his photo shoot he did with Nick Knight for the Face magazine in April of the same year. Traditional men's wardrobe pieces were present like full-length tailcoats and full suits, all while still looking sexy and fierce. The last half of the show featured more skin-revealing pieces in black and red or tartan and other striped patterns in materials like leather and lace, further upping the ante until the iconic finale. A masked model in a beautiful red beaded dress stepped down the runway into the center when a ring of fire encircled her. She weaved around and lamented her fate as the fires carried on, representing the death of Joanne by being burnt at the stake. When asked about his reference point or interest in Joanne, he stated, "I don't really get inspired by specific women. It's more in the minds of women in the past. People who are doomed, Joanne of Arc or Colette, iconic women." I think Joanne was a real masterpiece because he just showed again McQueen's anger and his knack for presenting women in a very fierce way that was not very conventional. It wasn't fierce in terms of them, they were like confident in their sexy body. They were fierce in terms of these women were strong and they went through something, and like his inspirations of strong women who went through something, like these women were fierce because it was just in them no matter what. It wasn't because of their sexualized body. It was because these women were honestly like against, like stacked against the wall or had the odds against them and almost like cornered into becoming the strong women they were, forced into being the strong women they were. And that makes sense when you take into the account that McQueen was very close with a lot of women who were abused in their lives, and McQueen himself was abused, and a lot of his work was about abuse. Like that was a very recurring trope in his work. So these women aren't fierce because of like, oh, they know they're sexy and they know they can pull men. No, they're fierce because they've been through it. Like they've been through something. My general thoughts on McQueen, of course, is that like I said just a while ago with the fierceness of women being forced into fiercity because of life beating them down, he always had a knack for just showing the strength independently of men. I think that last part I said about these women being independent because of abuse is just very important in terms of how McQueen represented the power of women. It was not dependent on men finding them attractive. It wasn't dependent on any of that. It was basically if it spoke to you as a woman because it related to you and you understood, you understood. Like McQueen's mother, she understood and she knew exactly where he was coming from because she's his mother. Like she knew what he was going through. She knew why McQueen made women look like that because she understands what he been through and what his sisters have been through in life. So it's really just an exhibition of if you get it, you get it. If you don't, you don't. He both took the repeated androgynous look of putting women in men's garments as well as the nudity and the sexualized imagery, but he used it both to just give power to the women. Just like how Rei Kawakubo gave power to the wearer because the wearer had to connect with the clothes first instead of just looking at this and being like, oh yeah, this is good, this works. McQueen also did that, in my opinion. Because of how McQueen channeled his anger and trauma through the clothes, he often got shouts of misogyny, violence, and called a hooligan by many journalists and just misinterpreted by journalists because they didn't understand. Like I said, if you get it, you get it. You don't, you don't. The last female designer we're going to speak about is Phoebe Philo. Of course, you can't speak about like elimination of gender norms and feminism in fashion without Phoebe Philo. I think Phoebe Philo's strongest contribution to fashion is her destruction of gender norms in society through the desexualization of women through her garments. She also took power away from men by putting women in men's garments, but she never like took away the woman's beauty by putting them in men's garments. To quote Sandra Kim in her essay, The Role of Luxury Fashion Brands in Women's Empowerment, this desexualization goes beyond the transgression of genres derived from appropriating the male wardrobe. It prioritizes a more intellectual approach to the body from the perspective of the harmony between the anatomy and clothes. Now, Phoebe Philo, if you don't know, if you're not into fashion, she has a strong following of people who call themselves the Philophiles because of how sensual her work is, how not fussy it is, how elegant and chic it is, without all of the misogyny and over sexualization and showing of the shoulder and showing of the this and the that of the body. They give women what they want from the perspective of a woman. The understitch video about Phoebe Philo is so good because she puts it in a sense where like Phoebe Philo understands her customer past the demographic. She understands them on like a person to person level. She knows exactly who she's selling to. So they feel so seen and understood when they see Phoebe Philo's clothes. They're like, oh my goodness, this is what we need. We don't need any of that other fussy, colorful dollification type clothes. We need the clothes that make us feel beautiful, we can form a personal relationship with, and it's just ours. It's not anybody else's. It's not for the male gaze. It's for our bodies. It's for our minds. Also, Phoebe Philo was coming up in fashion when it was a very like women's wear was a very male dominated space. There were so many male designers at big fashion houses of women's wear. There were so many, and she came through and just shook it up basically. She worked for Chloe from 2001 to 2006, and that's where she started to gain her cult like following and grow her name. In terms of what her work for Chloe looked like, in my opinion, it was a lot more youthful and fun than what her work ended up looking like for Celine in the future. Her absence was so strong after she left Chloe in 2006 that new brands with similar design aesthetics started popping up, like Victoria Beckham, the role and cause. They literally just gained popularity as she was gone. Like they took advantage, but they didn't even take advantage. They got lucky. They could only thrive as she wasn't there. But she did return to Celine in 2008, and her first collection for Celine was in spring summer 2010. And this was the start of a more streamlined, mature, sleeker look for Celine, more muted tones, more refined, and just more success. She, again, in the Understitch video, I believe she said that she quintupled Celine's sales at one point, and it was just a smash hit. She became the lead face of feminism in fashion, I believe, in terms of just giving women what they want, like for women, by a woman. Of course, this would not last, as she would leave Celine in 2017, and Hedi Slimane was appointed thereafter, and this was a disaster for so many women. Like, who's gonna give us the designs we need now? Hedi Slimane? Why is he at Celine? It was kind of crazy, I'm not gonna lie. And the role and Victoria Beckham saw success again, and without Celine, like without Phoebe Philo leaving Celine, we probably wouldn't be talking about the role nearly as much right now. But Phoebe Philo did start her own brand last year, and the prices are eye-watering, but all of the stuff does sell out, and it's pretty much a continuation of what she's been doing. Now, with the role specifically, I'd say, but in terms of more women's designers, of course, there's Victoria Beckham, there's Maria Grazia Chiuri at Dior. I know her debut collection was important with the whole we should all be feminist thing, even though Maria Grazia Chiuri's design is so awful. Like, it's so bad. Not even hating, I just think it's awful. But yeah, of course there are a lot more designers pushing this thing forward. The future is bright. Now, speaking on Alessandro Michele, he is kind of like a hybrid in terms of both women's wear and men's wear. I think his view of androgyny is so perfect and is so what it really is. Alessandro Michele's Autumn Winter 18 Cyborg were his thoughts on current humanity. It was a clash on more than just gender, but religions, regions, and more, as humans reproduce and reinvent themselves in this modern age and present themselves. It was inspired by Donna Haraway's semi-robotic manifesto in 1984, where she argued that gender lines are just as blurred as lines between a man and animal and man and machine. When speaking to Vogue, Michele said that the post-human era is underway and hearkened to the absence of binary gender roles in Gucci, saying that there's no more being just boys and girls. Now we have to decide what we want to be. That show is androgyny in the most maximalist way possible, and it is totally Michele. It is amazing. And his thought process, like if you look at what he's talking about, it's like heads in the arm, like like to show that you rebirth yourself, balaclava over the head to show like, oh, plastic surgery. Like, it's just, it's on all sides, all cylinders firing. Like, it is insane to look at. It's just so much to take in every single time you watch one of his shows, and that is like the true version of misogyny, when you fuse and confuse gender because you add male into female and you create a new identity because you get to choose, because now you get to pick whatever you want from this gender and that gender. You get to pick whatever cues, whatever appearance you want. By adding these two genders together, you get to create your new self. And he just hit it right on the head, in my opinion, with that show. Fall Winter 2020 was more so men's based androgyny, where Michele fashioned them as what Nicole Phelps of Vogue would describe as the perfection of little girls, and those little girls' minders, nuns to nurses included. Michele sees youth as beauty and freedom, so it makes sense. Lots of Michele in general does incorporate the freedom and impracticality of 20th century women's attire on men to induce that sense of dainty, soft, and vulnerable air on men that was assigned previously and reserved previously for women only. Along with this impracticality is less consequential details like colorful floral patterns, costumey accessories like glasses, and what some would describe as excessive glamourification. The type of excessive glamourification that objectified and crystallized women in society as nothing more than trophies. To be honest with y'all, to be completely honest with y'all, bro, before I made this video, I knew what Michele was kind of all about, but I never really looked exactly at what he was doing at Gucci. I'm a fraud, I admit it. But I cannot believe that he was getting away with that. I cannot believe that that's what they were letting that man do at Gucci. If you look at one of his, like, the Fall Winter 2020 show, I cannot believe that they let that man do that, bro. That is insane to me. I'm sorry. I love the fact that they let him do it, but I cannot believe, I just can't believe it. I'm just going to stop repeating myself. But yes, his androgyny is to the moon. And I think it's a very good representation of where we're going right now with how kids nowadays are finding themselves and recreating themselves every day. I'm very excited to see what he really fully starts to do at Valentino. The last design I'm going to talk about might blow your mind, but we are going to be speaking about Hedi Slimane. Please don't click off the video. Please don't click off the video. First, let's talk about David Bowie, all right? David Bowie was like glam rock, right? Glam rock fashion, which was scarcely represented at the time in that field, other than a few designers in the past, like Jean-Paul Gaultier or whoever. So he was not the first or the most important, but he's definitely worth mentioning on this list, I feel like. Now, returning to the indication of female roles in society being represented by certain female codes, we can return to the skinny jeans quote that was made by Calvin Klein that we previously looked at in Fashionopolis by Dana Thomas. Ultimately, skinny jeans were a female thing. It had a very strong female connotation that was very hard to destroy. So Income David Bowie, he does his thing, blah, blah, blah. And Income Hedi Slimane with androgyny presented through menswear. Skinny jeans, men wearing makeup on the runway, the models often having less sexually dimorphic traits in the face than, say, the male models of a Gucci show during the Tom Ford era. A Gucci show heavily leans on the dimorphic traits of men and women and heavily leans on showing off the body. I already spoke about that a million times, you get it. Slimane's models had less strikingly masculine features. Proportions of his outfits, along with the model choice, made men more leggy. Women are classically known to be more leggy due to their torso to lower body ratio being different due to their hip placement. His Celine 2020 show, just look at the models, bro. Just look at them. Not even the skinny jeans, like there weren't even that many skinny jeans in the show, but just the hair, the cheekbones, down to the lips and noses. It was all reminiscent of rock and roll stars of the past, who often had gender bending get-ups. Dior Homme 2005, skinny jeans, Chelsea boots, makeup, pussy bow ties, glittery shimmery clothing, long hair, uses of pinks and purples. All of these things were associated with women. And a lot of these things were associated loosely with preppiness. Preppiness was always associated with women. YSL Spring Summer 2014, a continuation of Hedi Slimane's work. Look at the models. There was a garden, bro. He put the garden in the show. Now, Hedi Slimane, after he left Dior in the 2000s, he lived in California for 5 years to soak up the rock culture and the surf culture and just the underground culture in general in California, and the garden were a part of it. So I'm thinking he really liked what they were doing and invited them on the show because they're tall, they look like they could model, and they killed it. And if you look at what Fletcher Shears of the Garden did with his whole like campaigning one time, it all ties back together. I just wanted an excuse to talk about the garden. I love the garden, if you couldn't tell. And I know personally you guys have heard of women say like, oh, I can't have no man with no jeans skinnier than mine, or oh, your jeans skinnier, that's your sister jeans, that's your girlfriend jeans. Like, this isn't just made up this isn't just made up stuff in my head. I'm not going crazy. Now, skinny jeans are way more common now, but back then, if you're wearing skinny jeans, you were probably either seen as gay or a part of a really underground subculture. Like, if you put Bon Mon by Christopher DeCarnin and Dior Homme or YSL by Hedi Slimane side by side, which one looks more conventional? Which one looks more irregular? Huh? You see where skinny jeans leans towards on the regular, on the natural? Over time, the gender assignment of skinny jeans with women got diminished drastically, and Hedi had a lot to do with it, I believe. And that's all I had to say. I'm sorry if I got very heated during that, but I truly believe that he really like did play a lot of a part into the shifting of it. I think he's like perfect person for perfect time. It couldn't be anybody else than him, and that's why he still has a job today. Even though his Celine is a bit more weird, but oh well. But overall, I think androgyny, I think fashion is the perfect medium to push forward something like gender fusion and androgyny and the destruction of gender norms in society, because fashion creates these norms just as much as they can destroy them. It created the norms back when we didn't have these type of conversations. We didn't have the awareness to have these type of conversations, so nobody ever spoke about it. But obviously, I can say things like fashion is the first mode of communication that we have with other people in society, because they see our clothes before they speak to us. You create your avatar based off of how you want to look, with things other than clothes like hairstyles, piercings, tattoos. So obviously appearance is very big, and fashion is like just a very complex battlefield of identity and pushing yourself out there, because you're always going to be perceived whether you like it or not based off of what you wear. So why not take things into your full hands? You can represent yourself as somebody who defies the mainstream, as well as the person who is a part of the group that you want to signify to. You can signify yourself to anybody through your fashion. Like, you can deceive through your fashion. You can create your entire identity through fashion. You can get lost in your identity through fashion if your entire identity only lies into clothing. It's so complex, but this is very fun to talk about. I hope it hit. I hope it landed. I hope I didn't say stupid things. I hope I didn't confuse anybody. I hope this video isn't like more than an hour long. It definitely won't be. And I hope you enjoyed. Oh my God.